17 million cubic meters of freezing concrete, snaking like a gray phantom along the jagged edges of the European continent. 1.2 million tons of heavy steel, ruthlessly poured across a staggering 2,400 miles of coastline. Stretching all the way from the howling winds of the Arctic Circle down to the sun-drenched border of Spain. These are not just dry statistics. This was the most massive, most arrogant defensive engineering project humanity had witnessed since the Great Wall of China. It consumed a volume of resources unmatched by any defensive structure in modern history, all in a desperate bid to seal Western Europe. Inside a gargantuan, impenetrable steel shell, yet this very same super wall, relentlessly hyped by the Nazi propaganda machine, and boasting a modern-day price tag of $160 billion, was violently ripped apart in a single morning. Today we are diving deep into the dark waters of this historical anomaly. We are pushing past the well-trodden battlefield narratives to decode the engineering fatal errors hidden beneath the blueprints in the cement. Why couldn't this resource-devouring Atlantic wall stop an invasion? Arriving in wooden Higgins boats, the real answer doesn't lie in the blood-stained waters of Omaha Beach. It is deeply embedded in an engineering roadmap that was doomed to catastrophic failure from day one. Germany paid a horrific price in blood to discover the three fatal engineering flaws hiding in plain sight within this megaproject. Rewind the clock to March 1942. In the dim light of his common bunker, Adolf Hitler issued the infamous Directive No. 40. He arrogantly demanded the creation of an impenetrable coastal barrier to completely seal off every inch of Europeans and from an Allied landing. This seemingly impossible task naturally fell to the organization Todt. This was the same engineering juggernaut that had built Germany's pride, the Autobahn network, and the Siegfried Line. They possessed immense field experience and a methodology that was rigidly systematic. They were handed an unprecedented engineering challenge: weld thousands of miles of coastline shut using an ocean of reinforced concrete and devastating crossfire on pristine blueprints. It looked like an absolute marvel of the industrial age. They designed over 600 highly standardized bunker models, part of a complex system known as the Regelby AU. It included everything from concealed infantry shelters and vicious anti-tank positions to massive coastal batteries capable of shrugging off heavy aerial bombs. Every single detail, from the precise thickness of the walls and the exact spacing of the rebar to the complex ventilation systems and heavy armored doors, was dictated by punishingly strict standardization. For instance, a standard TYP EB bunker boasted walls to meters thick, explicitly designed to survive direct, point-blank impacts from 210mm artillery. The TYP bunkers took this to a terrifying extreme, with walls 3.5 meters thick, built solely to remain standing under the merciless bombardment of heavy naval guns. However, this seemingly flawless masterpiece of industrial defense concealed the first fatal flaw, a slow-acting poison that would drain the very lifeblood out of the Third Reich's war machine. This first flaw was a bottomless, despair-inducing black hole of resources. To construct these immovable steel and concrete beasts on the beaches, Germany paid a price it simply could not afford during a grueling war of attrition. 1.2 million tons of high-grade steel were permanently buried beneath the sand and rocks of the coast. To put that staggering figure into perspective, it accounted for 5% of Germany's entire national steel production over 2 full years. 5% might sound like a mere blip on a peacetime financial report, but in the brutal meat grinder of the Second World War, let's translate that into cold, hard military currency. That 1.2 million tons of steel, had it been diverted to weapons factories, was enough to manufacture approximately 50,000 Panzer FOUR medium tanks. To understand the gravity of this, consider that throughout the entire bloody duration of World War II, the fully mobilized German armaments industry only managed to produce around 8,500 Panzer FOURS in total. The construction of the Atlantic Wall wasn't so much a defense against foreign invaders as it was a massive, self-inflicted cannibalization of the Third Reichskorps military strength. Making matters worse, those colossal, prehistoric-looking U-boat pens scattered along the French coast were each ruthlessly swallowing up between 80,000 and 130,000 cubic meters of concrete. Simultaneously, the top-secret launch sites for the V weapons and various Luftwaffe facilities were all desperately competing for these same precious building materials. Here, history reveals its most absurd, ironic paradox. Hitler drained his nation's coffers to build this lifeless wall with the fundamental goal of using fixed, tireless fortifications to replace precious human manpower. He wanted to free up divisions for the desperately bleeding Eastern Front, but his megalomaniacal mind completely failed to foresee that this greedy concrete leviathan would not save manpower instead. It would starve the very factories meant to produce life-saving weapons for those front-line soldiers, countless tons of precious steel that could have become the crushing tracks of tanks, the fire-breathing barrels of artillery, and the roaring engines of fighter planes were instead transformed into cold, dead rebar, permanently locked away on the French coast, utterly useless when the fate of the nation was decided. If the extreme squandering of national resources was a chronic disease guaranteeing eventual defeat, the second flaw was a tactical slice to the jugular. This seemingly majestic defense line fundamentally lacked the most critical element of military defense depth. The organization Todd's deeply proud standardized construction program, while achieving peak industrial efficiency, committed a childishly fatal error in the brutal logic of war, driven by Allied intelligence. Misdirected in the High Command's own subjective assumptions, the Germans stubbornly concentrated their incredibly precious heavy artillery at the narrowest point of the English Channel, the Pas de Calais. There they densely packed 495 terrifying heavy guns of 150mm caliber and above, purely because Adolf Hitler himself was paranoid and absolutely convinced that this was the inevitable landing zone for the main Allied force. Meanwhile, in the 7th Army sector covering Normandy and Brittany, where the actual life or death struggle would explode, the sprawling hundreds of miles of coastline were defended by a sparse, scattered collection of only about 200 heavy guns. The entire distribution of the Atlantic Wall was despairingly described by General Hans von Salmuth, commander of the 15th Army, as a thin and fragile cord. His colleague, General Blumentritt, was even more blunt, stating that it wasn't a wall at all, but merely an isolated chain of fortifications with zero depth, ready to shatter at the first touch. This was the fatal soft underbelly of the highly praised Regel BA standardization system. It merely smeared a thin, brittle crust of concrete across a vast expanse of coast. It completely failed to establish the deep, layered system required for a flexible, elastic defense. Tactically speaking, every heavily fortified bunker was just an isolated concrete tomb. These so-called strong points were often separated by fatal gaps stretching for kilometers. And these crucial spaces, which should have been heavily guarded, were filled with nothing more than flimsy barbed wire and pathetically shallow trenches. An even more lethal tactical blind spot lay in the very design of the gun emplacements. Most of these bunkers were not designed to face the open ocean and engage enemy ships head-on. Instead, they work leverly, angled to lay down flanking and file a D-fire against infantry charging up the beach. While this design is undeniably vicious against light infantry, it brought about catastrophic consequences. Once a well-equipped Allied unit, under the cover of a massive naval bombardment, punched through that initial beach defense, even if they only pushed a few hundred yards inland, these unbelievably expensive, indestructible bunkers instantly became useless concrete husks. Their massive bodies, couldn't swivel, and their guns couldn't turn to fire into their own rear areas. History is full of dark humor. In 1940, when the French naively relied on their seemingly impregnable Maginot Line, Hitler used the mobility of his Panzer divisions to cleverly bypass it, achieving the brilliant success of the Blitzkrieg, yet just a few years later. He seemed to have completely forgotten the very lessons of war he had written himself. He turned around, exhausted. His nation's strength, and built an even more rigid, even more fragile coastal Maginot Line. We finally arrive at the third, the most unsolvable, and the most lethal systemic engineering flaw. This wasn't just the failure of a few individual structures, it was the total collapse of a three-dimensional defense system. In the mechanized warfare of the mid-20th century, any modern defensive engineering project absolutely could not rely solely on static concrete and rusting steel. On the ground, it had to be a dynamic, integrated system supported by an umbrella of air superiority, a shield of naval dominance, and a mobile ground strike force. But the massive Atlantic Wall was like a giant stripped of its soul. It desperately lacked that vital protective umbrella in the sky and the barrier on the waves. By the fateful early summer of 1944, the once invincible Luftwaffe had been reduced to a mere phantom over the vast skies of France. The Third Air Fleet, responsible for the immense defense Belgium and the Netherlands possessed a nominal, pathetic strength of roughly 400 aircraft on paper. Making matters worse, most of the remotely capable combat fighters among them had been frantically recalled to the German homeland in a desperate attempt to try and fend off swarms of Allied strategic bombers. On D-Day itself, the skies were totally dominated by the massive Allied forces. They launched an extravagant 14,000 sorties of various aircraft, weaving an impenetrable dark net of death. From above, in stark contrast, the defending German Air Force completely scraped together everything they had to launch a miserable 319 sorties, completely stripped of all vital air cover. Those giant concrete artillery fortresses fixed on the coastline became perfect, helpless targets for the massive heavy guns of the powerful Allied Navy. On June 6, 1944, the USS Texas battleship alone unleashed an insane barrage of 440. One massive 14-inch armor-piercing shells directly into German positions, accompanied by 253 rounds from its 5-inch secondary battery. And that was just the tiny tip of the iceberg. Paired with the massive British Royal Navy fleet, the Allies perfectly executed a merciless, pinpoint annihilation of the coastal fortifications the Germans were so extremely proud of, in the face of absolute naval supremacy and overwhelming air control. No matter how thick the concrete or how clever the heavy armored doors, they instantly shattered like concretely damp paper toys. More despair-inducing than totally losing air and sea control at the front lines was the deep strategic tearing and paralysis. Deeply hidden within the German High Command itself, faced with this massive multi-billion-dollar wall, the three highest decision-makers in the German military harbored three totally incompatible strategic visions. At a critical moment of life and death, they completely failed to reach any substantive tactical consensus. The deeply experienced Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal von Rundest, TET, perfectly saw through the highly fragile nature of this wall from the beginning. He bluntly considered it a completely gigantic propag and a prop, built to purely bluff the enemy and pacify the population. He strongly advocated for totally abandoning a rigid defense of the beaches. Instead, he wanted to step back and build a deep, highly mobile defense system. Let the Allies land, let them stretch their supply lines, and then use the elite Panzer reserves gathered deep inland to immediately launch a massive counterattack on the open plains, fully encircling and crushing the highly unstable Allied forces. However, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who was urgently sent by Hitler in late 1943 to highly, aggressively accelerate the engineering progress, arrived at the exact opposite conclusion, having personally suffered under the terrifying Allied air superiority in North Africa. Rommel firmly believed that once the massive Allies successfully landed and established a solid beachhead, the German Panzer divisions wouldn't even be able to freely move or mass together during daylight hours without being bombed into scrap metal. That would totally mean an irreversible slide into destruction. Therefore, he passionately argued that the enemy had to be totally annihilated right on the beaches, at the water's edge, when the Allied soldiers had just left there. Landing craft and were still struggling in the heavy surf, their absolute most vulnerable moment. To achieve this, Rommel fiercely demanded that the most elite armored divisions be deployed right against the dangerous coastal zones ready for an immediate massive counterattack. Faced with this irreconcilable, fundamental tactical divide between his top generals, Adolf Hitler, sitting perfectly safely in his heavily protected headquarters, made the absolute worst, most taboo compromise. In military science, he foolishly split his precious Panzer reserve straight in half. One portion was stationed near Paris, far from the coast, as a strategic reserve. Another portion was scattered in southern France to guard against a threat in the Mediterranean. And Rommel, who was actually fully responsible for the coastal defense, ultimately only managed to secure direct command of a truly pathetic 3 armored divisions. This foolish attempt to please both sides resulted in neither Run DSTET's deep mobile defense nor Rommel's beachhead annihilation plan ever being truly executed. On the dark, thunderous morning of June 6th, as thousands of brave Allied soldiers surged onto the beaches like a massive tidal wave, the Supreme Commander, Adolf Hitler, was heavily sleeping soundly in his bunker because they lacked his explicit personal authorization. Those inland Panzer reserves, possessing immense firepower and mobility that could have drastically altered the course of the battle, were forced to sit idle, their engines roaring uselessly, not daring to move an inch during the most critical hours of the invasion. In the end, the sweat and blood of 286,000 forced foreign laborers, prisoners of war, and innocent concentration camp inmates, alongside a bottomless investment equivalent to $160 billion and 1 million tons of steel that ate up 5% of the nation's capacity, all evaporated into a mirage amidst the deafening roar of naval gunfire. It all crumbled because of an utterly absurd command system and a fractured, incoherent strategic plan. The Atlantic Wall, the final, desperate spectacle built by Nazi Germany, uses its scarred ruins to powerfully prove a cold truth to future generations in modern warfare. Any purely static engineering project that is entirely divorced from air superiority, naval dominance, and mobile strike forces lacking true systemic support will ultimately fail, no matter how many astronomical resources you completely consume, and no matter how thick and strong you pour the concrete, it will only ever amount to a lifeless, highly decorated concrete tomb, passively waiting to be slaughtered. The Atlantic Wall stands as a monumental testament to human hubris and the fatal cost of strategic engineering blindness. If you found this deep dive into history's most expensive concrete tomb fascinating, do not forget to smash that like button and subscribe. Join us next time as we continue to unearth the hidden engineering flaws that shaped the deadliest conflicts in history. I am your strategy observer. See you next time.